joining us here virtually in the Museum of Anthropology. At least I'm here in the Museum of Anthropology, and I'm so happy that everyone else can be joining us remotely over Zoom today. I'm very excited to speak with everyone. But before I begin, I just wanted to say that I'm very excited to answer people's questions. However, please save them for the end or write them in the chat feature of Zoom. That would be great. My assistant director, Sarah, will be monitoring the chat. So she'll be able to send me any questions that are immediately pertinent to what I'm talking about. Otherwise, we'll answer them at the end. My plan today is to show some images, share a slideshow I've prepared, and talk a little bit about an upcoming exhibit at the Museum of Anthropology. You know, in some ways, today's event is just a little bit of a preview. I mean, it actually is honestly a replacement, because we were hoping that the museum would be open to the public by this time. Of course, the pandemic is not yet where it needs to be, where we can reopen campus to the public. So instead of opening a public exhibit, which features a lot of amazing student research, research I had conducted with students last semester and that I'm going to share today, instead of just waiting and delaying until the fall when we likely open and everyone can come see the final exhibit, I thought I'd share this preview, a kind of a lecture about the philosophy and some of the theories and ideas that underscored student research. So it's a preview of kind of not necessarily the students' research, because I still want that to be a surprise, but rather it's kind of the idea that generated the entire exhibit, what the students all learned about and worked with to kind of come up with their own research. Their research projects took them to the Pacific Islands. They looked at objects in the Museum of Anthropology's collections that were all collected from the Pacific region. And they put together an exhibit about that, but it challenges some usual preconceptions or some usual stereotypes about what the story of Pacific art and material culture is. So that's really what I wanted to share with you all today. All right, let me begin. Hopefully everyone can see that. Sarah, is that displaying correctly? Thank you. So the Museum of Anthropology here at Wake Forest University is home to a number of artifacts from the Pacific Islands. We have actually quite a large collection if you include all of our objects from the Pacific Islands, but I'm going to focus on a small sample of that larger collection today, 30-some objects that were all originally collected before they came to the Museum of Anthropology. They were all collected by a world-famous collector named George Ortiz. Ortiz acquired most of these objects in the 1960s and 70s, and for many years, these objects were part of his collection, this prestigious collection of antiquities and ethnographic objects that were assembled from around the world. While it is widely regarded by many experts in archaeology, art history, anthropology, widely regarded as a world-class collection, many of the methods he employed to acquire those objects have been called into question, not only recently with renewed focus on restitution and repatriation in museum context, but his methods were even called out during his lifetime. He was a controversial figure even while he was in the midst of his collecting activities. So what I wanted to do is share his story and how the story of how all of these artifacts came to be, how they came to be collected and brought out of their Pacific contexts. I want to share how that story then shapes what our students here at Wake Forest do, what they learn about, and how they're learning to contextualize and think about the history of objects like the ones we'll see. Here's a sample of some of the objects that you'll see on display in the Culture at Stake exhibit when the museum reopens. These are all objects that were researched by Wake Forest students as part of their semester-long project. Essentially, every student got assigned an object, and then by using documentary evidence, paperwork files, letters, as well as ethnographic observations published in academic literature, they come to try to figure out what the meaning of these objects are, what they represent, what kind of context they may have been used in, and what they might have meant to the people who valued them. Oftentimes in these kinds of exhibits, we talk about objects in terms of their types. It's a very handy way in a museum to describe what we have on display. In fact, we've had exhibits that focus on these exact themes. Take the object in the top right corner of the screen, this large wooden tree trunk that's been hollowed out and carved into a slit gong, this resonant percussive instrument. It was on display as part of an exhibit of musical instruments from the Pacific Rim. So sometimes we exhibit them just as these types, as musical instruments. In fact, right now we also have an exhibit of wealth and status items, an exhibit just on exchange objects, again, from the Pacific region, curated by one of our student interns. This ivory necklace made out of sperm whale ivory. Ivory is actually a material substance formed by several different mammals, and of the aquatic mammals, there's quite a few. Walruses are known in the Arctic, but in the Hawaiian Islands, people have access to sperm whale ivory, which is what those beads were likely carved from. These kind of wealth and status objects are also put on display, interpreted as this kind of type of object. And of course, many anthropology exhibits focus on practical technology, tools and useful objects like this adze, this woodworking tool from Vanuatu. Of course, museum exhibits also look at other kinds of ways of framing objects. In addition to type, sometimes we have exhibits that focus on materials. Many of the students that come to the Museum of Anthropology are actually interested in material science. They're interested in conservation science. And for that, they really need to know the kinds of wood or shell or stone or glass that different ethnographic and archaeological objects are made out of. And so many times students are gravitated toward these physical characteristics of objects. So we've had objects or exhibits that focus on fiber, for example, or wood. Oftentimes these material exhibitions focus on aesthetics. They present objects as artistic works, right, worthy of visual inspection. And certainly that could be the case for objects themed around wood carving or fiber arts from the Pacific. In fact, right now, curated by my intern, Robbie, we have an exhibit of objects just made out of different kinds of animals, of shell and bone, for example, like this necklace made out of bat teeth or flying foxes from the Pacific. These are large frugivorous bats that have these enormous teeth that have been strung into this necklace from the island nation of Kiribati. But none of these are the exhibit theme that my students worked on. In fact, the exhibit theme my students looked at was the object provenances themselves. So the provenance of a museum object is its history of how it got to the museum. It's often imagined as its chain of ownership, what rungs of this chain it passed through to get to the museum from the collector, all the way back to the originator, the person who created the object itself. Of course, it doesn't have to be just ownership. There are other ways that, it doesn't just have to be a chain of ownership. There are other ways that this object might move through the world. And certainly, objects are continuing to move. And that was one of the points I really tried to emphasize with my students as they researched objects like this. An Australian Aboriginal wooden shield from Northern Australia, again, part of the George Ortiz collection. When our students researched this, they weren't interested in its usefulness as a wooden weapon or defensive object. They weren't interested in its formal carving properties. What we were interested in is the backstory of how it came from Ortiz to the Museum of Anthropology. And perhaps even more importantly, how it got from an Australian Aboriginal person sometime in the late 19th century to George Ortiz, world famous European art collector. The students uncovered a very interesting story, and it's one that I'm going to give in a little bit more detail here. So with that, before we look at our principal cast of characters, I want to introduce us to the setting, because already I've presented 7 objects that I've claimed, or at least implicitly linked together as all being from something called the Pacific. But what is the Pacific? So, of course, the common sense answer, the Pacific is a geographic region, right? I have this lovely physical map here showing the geography of the Pacific region, right? We can see the Australian continent, Papua New Guinea above it, New Zealand off to the east from Australia, and then all of these small atolls and islands kind of spread out across the Pacific Ocean, right? So there's this geographic, this material sense of what the Pacific is. We can identify it, but ultimately that's not necessarily what we mean. I mean, we're not actually talking about this geographic region. We're layering in a lot more than just geography when we talk about the Pacific. Within anthropology and within museums, we often talk about culture when we talk about the Pacific. And anthropologists have, looked at cultures all around the world, looked at their commonalities, looked at their differences, looked at how they make meaning and how they have functional economies, all of these different features of different people's societies. And they've looked at broad similarities, breaking them up into what we might think of as these cultural families. And in the Pacific, the broad separation of these different cultural families is a tripartite division into Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia, depicted here, right? So we've already gone from just this geographic reality, right? This expanse of land and water. And now we're layering on it some overlays, right? This cultural mapping of what these islands mean. But we also don't usually mean culture specifically when we're talking about the Pacific. In fact, you could see from my labeling of those objects, we often label them according to something else. We often label them according to nationality. But nationality in the Pacific is as much a feature of culture as it is, or I'm sorry, as much a feature of colonialism as it is culture or geography. In fact, if we look at this, this political boundary map, you can see how far we've gotten from the open expanse of ocean islands to arbitrary lines carving up this area of the Pacific. And as much as within history and anthropology and contemporary politics, we talk about right now being a post-colonial period, it's important to note that for the Pacific Islands, right now is also the colonial period. Many Pacific Islands are still colonial holdings. In fact, most of the US's colonial territorial holdings are in the Pacific, as well as other European powers as a holdover from the colonial era. So it's important to note that when we talk about the Pacific, we're kind of talking about all three of these things simultaneously. We're talking about the Pacific as a geographic reality, as a part of the earth we can point to. We're talking about it as a cultural phenomena, as Pacific culture being some, in at least vaguely linked cultural phenomena, or at least divided into these three broader groups. And finally, we can think about the Pacific as a colonial reality, as a series of political interacting boundaries and societies that are an outgrowth of a very specific history. In fact, that history is pretty manifest by some of our museum objects, including this one I'm holding up here. I apologize, I rushed through those objects so quickly. I forgot to mention I have them all in front of me as well. So if you're looking at the screen, you can switch over to my live video feed, and you can see I'm showing actually the oil dish that's depicted on the screen right now. This oil dish is bound up in all three meanings of the Pacific right there, of geography, of culture, and of colonialism. In fact, this object was collected by none other than Captain James Cook himself, a navigator and explorer concerned with geography, with mapping the Pacific, also concerned with culture. In addition to mapping, Captain Cook collected an enormous volume of ethnographic material describing the different cultures and peoples that he encountered. And finally, Captain Cook is certainly a figure of colonialism, initiating the European colonial era in the Pacific. That mapping, that investigation of different cultures is really in service of European powers that are funding Cook's expeditions. And so when he brings back objects like this oil dish, that's part of this colonial legacy. So how do we get from Captain Cook to Ortiz? I actually just gave a talk about this a few weeks ago, and I'm not going to reframe every link of this provenance chain because that itself is its own lecture and a very interesting story. But it's enough to say that Captain Cook's collecting is not unique. While it's the start of collecting in the Pacific, it's replicated thousands of times over the next 2 centuries or more. And all of these objects, all of these dishes, all of these headrests, right? All of these amazing flying fox tooth necklaces, right? All of these objects are entering Europe and entering North America, and they're being purchased by collectors by George Ortiz. So George Ortiz is born in 1927 in Paris, France. He's the son of the Bolivian ambassador to France, and his mother is the daughter of one of the wealthiest persons in the world, Simon Patiño, a Bolivian tin baron, owner of almost all the tin mines in Bolivia, as well as other mineral concerns throughout South America. This has made Simon's family immensely wealthy. And his grandson, George, decides to, after his schooling, go out into the world, like so many, I don't know, incredibly wealthy, well politically connected young men in post-World War II Europe, and he traveled throughout Europe. While he was traveling, he became interested in ancient Grecian sculpture. He's 22 years old in 1949, and he travels to Greece, and he becomes enamored with these antiquities. He links it. I actually have added a lot of quotes. George Ortiz was quite a prolific writer, as I'll talk about throughout this talk. And so in today's discussion, I've included his own words to give a sense of who this person was, because this is his own language and how he chose to represent himself. He connects his interest in collecting in antiquities to his own political leanings, right? He very clearly says that as a young person, he was interested in Marxism, but after studying ancient Greece, he realized that Marxism was not the way, that something closer to this Grecian democratic ideal that he became enamored with, that this was his guiding moment in life. But he didn't see this to become a politician. No, he saw this to become a collector. And through the act of collecting Greek sculpture and Greek antiquities, that he could kind of create this, almost this visual reference, this truth made manifest in the sculptures of ancient works that kind of correlated with his political outlook, with his philosophy on life. And that if only he could assemble all of these different things together, he could show how true it is, right? So his overarching interest has always and was always in collecting antiquities. But our story intersects with the Pacific, because in the 1960s, about, a dozen years after he began collecting Greek antiquities, George Ortiz became interested in ethnography. There's a boom in post-World War II ethnography. So perhaps this is what Ortiz is sensing. This is what he's reading and becoming interested in. Whatever it is, he travels to the Pacific, and like his moment in Greece, he has this revelatory experience. He goes to the Pacific and he sees, like in his formal interpretation of Greek sculpture, and how he sees in Greek sculpture these idealized forms representative of an idealized philosophy, he sees something similar in the Pacific. But it's important to note, he does not see Pacific Island peoples and ancient Greeks as commensurate in their philosophical outlook, even though they might share maybe formalistic leanings in their artwork, which is something we'll return to again. However, over the course of his 50-year plus career in collecting works of art, antiquities, and ethnographic works, he has been embroiled in numerous controversies. And these were not controversies that crept up on him. These were controversies that he leaned into, that he celebrated, that he engineered himself. For example, here he is pictured with a Benin head, an Edo bronze sculpture representing a king figure from the ancient African city-state of Benin, now in modern-day Nigeria. This statue was taken during the punitive raid expedition of 1897, where the British military invaded the sovereign state of Benin and punished them for not submitting to British colonial rule. They did this by sacking the palace and stealing the entire royal treasury. Hundreds of valuables, carved elephant ivory tusks, bronze heads like these, bronze plaques, which are now found throughout the museums of Europe, as well as private collectors like George Ortiz. Of course, recently, within the past several years even only, There has been immense interest in Benin antiquities specifically, like this head, about repatriating them, returning them from museum collections to Nigeria. In fact, this quote is from just a few days ago, where a new civic museum in Berlin, a new museum that has kind of formed to house former German colonial collections, the Humboldt Forum, has recently announced they will not exhibit their own Benin heads and instead will start actively repatriating them. This is something that Ortiz would have been appalled by. Ortiz passed away in 2012, but before he did, he left behind a prolific written legacy. He was well known for championing against cultural heritage protection laws. He championed against the 1970 UNESCO Accord, as well as the 1995 UNIDROIT Convention protecting cultural heritage and prohibiting certain kinds of export. He strongly believed, and perhaps because of his own position as the grandson of one of the wealthiest people in the world, that if you had the resources, that private ownership of cultural heritage, of patrimony, should be not only allowed, but encouraged. Perhaps drawing an analogy to wildlife management, pointing out that those with resources to invest in this kind of protection scheme are the ones that should be encouraged to. How hunters are encouraged to invest in wildlife management in order to extract animals from it. Ortiz made a similar argument, and he would again be controversial for railing against public protection of cultural heritage. It wasn't just his public views, though. It was also his personal dealings that drew controversy. George Ortiz in the mid-1960s was fined for funding illegal looting expeditions in Greece, not just buying illegally looted antiquities in a market, but actually funding the looters themselves, targeting intact archaeological sites with professional excavators in order to withdraw the best material, right? So this is a serious crime above kind of the typical kinds of illicit dealings and circuitous art markets. This is maybe a level above that. Further, after his death in 2014, the George Ortiz collection was found liable for returning sacred Maori panels, which Ortiz was accused of illegally and knowingly exporting from New Zealand in the late 1970s. So it took, in that case, over 30 years for that repatriation to come, but it actually was ultimately forced. So Ortiz, all of this is to point out that Ortiz, by his own actions and by his own written account, was a very controversial figure in the world of collecting. Ultimately, though, his collecting strategy was effective. His collection is today existing, and it still is widely regarded as one of the most significant collections of antiquities and ethnographic works, pulling in materials that are ancient, that are well-sourced, that are unique in certain aspects, unaccounted for in some ways. And so, while controversial, he did commit to it. He explains his philosophy in creating this collection as one linked to a concept of humanism, as art as a projection of some kind of universal human impulse, that his collecting actually is not a divisive activity, not separating people from their cultural heritage or patrimony, but rather something that's shared by everyone, something that he is just as much a part of as any descendant community is, by virtue of art having this universal appeal. Of course, another guiding philosophy of his collections is neoliberal democracy. I mentioned that, strangely enough, Ortiz directly connects his, for lack of a better word, religious experience with art to his own political orientation, expressly showing how his encounters with ancient Greek art led from his conversion from Marxism to kind of a more neoliberal democratic stance. And he does this in part to protect property rights, of course, because again and again in his writings, he shows how the ancient Greeks were concerned with the rule of law and the rule of protecting the rights of the individual property owner. And this makes sense in his context of his illegal looting, that he is so committed to collecting objects that justify the methods he himself is employing in this collecting exercise. And that certainly is one way of reading his collection, reading his or interpreting his collection today. Yet another way, though, another theory that undergirds all of Ortiz's collecting efforts is this implicit assumption, this implicit belief in the outmoded concept of unilinear cultural evolution. Unfortunately, we have anthropologists to thank for popularizing this theory to begin with. Ortiz probably wouldn't have heard about it without them to start with. But unilinear evolutionary theory was a dominant social evolutionary theory from the late 19th centuries, at least through the mid 20th century. And so it isn't shocking that Ortiz subscribed to this idea that cultures could be objectively reckoned, that they were actually at objective levels of advancement and morality for that matter. In fact, in Ortiz's writing, he expressly links concepts like justice or morality or beauty to these different stages of civilization. And of course, like many of his contemporaries, he links ancient Greece as the pinnacle of this kind of cultural evolution. And of course, his own background as a wealthy kind of European elite, he sees himself as an inheritor of the Grecian democratic legacy. So in many ways, these three currents, humanism, neoliberal democracy, and unilinear cultural evolution, very three different currents, all coming from different areas, but all informing why Ortiz is choosing certain objects to go into his collection. Now, none of that would have mattered, right? Ortiz still has his collection. None of that would have mattered to us, the Museum of Anthropology, if not for some historical idiosyncrasies. So before we continue with the George Ortiz story, I want to back up again a little bit and tell a parallel story, because the story of how this cook object, this dish, got to Ortiz is also relevant, even if it's telling a slightly different story. So before the dish got to Ortiz, it actually went here to this exact museum. This is a depiction of the Laverian Museum, a late 18th and early 19th century museum in London. This was a natural history museum that showed animals, plants, minerals, different specimens collected from all over the world to a paying public in London. In addition, the owner, Ashton Lever, was a personal friend and supporter of James Cook. When Captain Cook returned from his second voyage to Tonga in 1776, he came back with this Fijian bowl, as well as many other objects of material culture. Ashton Lever bought a huge assortment of these objects for display at his museum. At the museum, these objects are thought of in many different ways. Some of the ways are shared by George Ortiz, his interest in looking at common features between these objects. But while Ortiz is unfettered by any kind of appeal to consensus or objectivity or even research, the museums are not. And so the museums, working in a scientific discourse, working in collaboration with many other collections, their view on objects are changing. In addition, these museums are producing a new kind of researcher, anthropologists. These anthropologists I mentioned before, they go on to develop theories of unilinear evolution, in part based on these objects that are collected. But the objects continue to be there, and anthropologists continue to research them. And over time, they begin to discard these concepts of unilinear evolution in favor of other ideas of interpreting culture, and in part drawn from the objects on display in museums themselves. After World War II, and really in the 1960s and 1970s, anthropology becomes starts to investigate kind of different currents. Whereas before, the materialistic focused anthropologists of the 19th century and the early 20th century, those filling the museums with objects like this Cycladic idol that is still in the George Ortiz collection. While anthropologists are busy studying those, they begin to suspect something, that maybe the durable meanings, the interpretations they're layering into these objects, maybe they're not as secure as they initially thought. Take, for example, the ambiguity of just interpreting different gestures, like this sculpture. How could you interpret this gesture in such a way that's meaningful to people today and meaningful to the people who made it thousands of years ago? I mean, we have even enough trouble interpreting this gesture, a wink. I mean, is the wink meaning we're exchanging a secret, that it's a salacious come on, that it is an innocent expression of mirth, that I have something caught in my eye? A wink without the context around it is unknowable. This is a classic trope within anthropological theory coming out of this idea of symbolism, that the formal properties in objects, in people, in gestures, in behaviors can only be understood in their context. And without the context around it, without the cultural ideas surrounding it, it becomes much, much harder to adequately understand. So the symbolic turn has major implications for people like Ortiz. Ortiz, who is so sure that as a connoisseur, as the ultimate collector, he can intuitively see an object like a cedro newaiuai, this dish used for holding scented coconut oil, scented with lemba fruit. This dish has almost no meaning to Ortiz in that context. Ortiz certainly, in his writing on this dish, did not identify the meaning. In fact, he misidentified where the dish even was from. So his intuitive eye fails him in trying to understand what this object actually meant to the people who used it, rather than what it means to Ortiz himself. This symbolic turn coincides with a crisis in Ortiz's world. Following colonialism, there's a crisis in the world of high stakes art collecting, especially high stakes ethnographic art collecting. Now, with the former colonial ethnographic subjects, at least in some modicum of self-direction and control, they're starting to push back against the interpretations and stereotypes that people like George Ortiz are layering on them in their collecting activities. And so this creates kind of a crisis for the European art market, for the collecting world. How do you judge the meaning, and in that case, the value of these objects? A new standard arises, something called authenticity, a standard that collectors, gallerists, and museums still operate with today. The idea being that older objects that were used, that were not somehow used in artifice for a presentation, or made as a model, or made as a demonstration, that real objects, authentic objects are prioritized, are more valuable. And so this is how Ortiz views the art world. So an object like this, while once may be valued by Ortiz for its formal properties, its lines, its composition of shapes and forms, it's now valued because of its association with Captain Cook, because of its authenticity, its provenance that links it back to this pre-independence and even pre-colonial moment, which is now being prioritized in the collecting world. So these two strains are coming together. This symbolic turn in anthropology that's positing that the meaning of objects is only understandable within their context, and taken out of that context, they lose their meaning. And the collector side, which is saying objects, when they're taken out of their context, we freeze them in time. They stop having any more meanings. They only are meaning to this authentic pre-colonial past. So two different ways of starting to reckon kind of how meaning is maybe not inherent in these objects, but actually kind of determined, and in the case of art collecting, frozen in time. Now, again, none of this would have mattered to the Museum of Anthropology except for a tragic event, a chance idiosyncratic twist of history. George Ortiz's daughter in 1977 is kidnapped off the streets of Geneva, Switzerland. Again, Ortiz is known to come from one of the wealthiest families of his period. In addition to that, he's well known as one of these incredibly wealthy collectors of ancient art, a foremost elite within the art collecting world. So in 1977, gangsters looking for money target the Ortiz family. They make an opportunity when Ortiz's daughter, Gurstelle, is on her way to kindergarten in the chauffeured family car, and gunmen stop the car, carjack them, and steal Gurstelle. She's held ransom for 10 days and held for $2 million ransom. Ortiz, as this still is taken from, goes on TV and pleads with the kidnappers to release his daughter. They refuse unless the payment is made, and Ortiz makes the payment, pays $2 million. Gurstelle is released unharmed, but in the midst of this, Ortiz confesses or reveals that his family wealth is gone. He is no longer has the money. In fact, he didn't have $2 million to pay the ransom. He had to borrow the money in order to pay for Gurstelle's ransom. In order to, what had happened is, in addition to the family, losing money in its business transactions over time, diversifying its holdings, all of that, Ortiz had sunk a huge amount of the family fortune into collecting works of art, into ancient works, into provenance. Essentially, his belief, his neoliberal belief that objects like this continued to represent individual stores of value was called up, essentially. And so in order to come up with the money to repay back his ransom loan, Ortiz was forced to auction off a significant portion of his collection at Sotheby's in 1978. And so of the hundreds of works auctioned that day, Gordon Haynes, Winston-Salem business magnate and patron of the arts in North Carolina and Winston-Salem specifically, purchases some 30 objects from the auction expressly for the Museum of Anthropology. This was a curious fact, in fact, because up until this point, there had been very, very few donations to the Museum of Anthropology. In fact, it wasn't exactly clear at all why Gordon Haynes was donating this until my students and I started digging into some of our documentary evidence to uncover why would Haynes buy these collection of objects from this kind of infamous auction and immediately donate them to the Museum of Anthropology, which up until that point had not really had material objects. Well, it has to do with this man, Pendleton Banks, the museum's founder. Penn Banks and Gordon Haynes were close personal friends. And concurrently with concurrently with the auction, the museum is busily moving in and opening its public space for the first time. The first public Museum of Anthropology opened in Ranolda Village in the former, or what had been a barn at one point, and opened there to the public. In addition to its exhibits and outreach programs, all created with Penn Banks's own personal collections of objects he had brought back from the Caribbean, from China, from Africa, from his travels and research throughout the world, Penn also started to solicit donations from other Wake Forest faculty to expand the kinds of objects that the museum could interpret for its visitors and for students. However, it wasn't until the late 70s that the museum started to formalize that collection from kind of a hodgepodge of different objects to something that it committed to conserving in perpetuity, a modern museum collection. Of course, Haynes knows this, being good friends with Banks, and sensing the opportunity to purchase well-provenanced objects, that is, objects that, just like Ortiz valued, have an aura of authenticity. They date back to before the colonial period, or at least to the early colonial period of the 19th century. And therefore, they're somehow more reflective, more representative of culture, of anthropological types, of this kind of system of unilinear evolution, as well as symbolic anthropology that are kind of debating within professional anthropology circles like Banks is running in at the time. Ultimately, Banks accessions these objects and decides to use them to demonstrate material culture from the Pacific. So already these objects have had three interesting lives after their collection, or at least the bowl has, after their collection from Captain Cook. It went into the Leverian Museum, where it was seen as an example of the natural world. Then it went to the Ortiz collection, where it was seen as an example of kind of universal formal art. And now it's at the Museum of Anthropology, where it's seen as an example of a specific culture. However, the museum today continues to grow. We've taken Dr. Banks's legacy and we continue to work on it because the interpretation of these objects is never changing. Now, our students are learning just as much about the history of these objects and how these objects intersect with colonialism, with racism, with inequities today, with environmental justice today, with how these objects can intersect with not just kind of universal cultural types or art or the history of nature, those broad subjects that were the topics of interpretation in museums of the past centuries, but in today's museums being interpreted within their specific historical context. And of course, thinking about how that context intersects with the lives of people today. I'll end by stating about this bull. We recently reached out to the National Museum of Fiji about this bull because in the course of our research, we found that with its provenance to the second Captain Cook expedition of 1774 to 1776 or so, that this bull was likely collected from Tonga in 1775, but it likely came before that from Fiji at least several years prior. This would make it the earliest known dish of this style, a dish used by Fijian priests in the preparation of this coconut oil. This would make it the earliest known example of this form in existence. So we recently reached out to the Fijian Museum to see what kind of collaborative opportunities there are, what kind of interest there is in something like this, if it has any special meaning today, or if it is just a piece of formal art, as Ortiz thought. All right, I'm leaving it today on a couple of images of our current exhibits. We're not open yet, but when we do open, I hope that you come back and visit us and see some of the work that our students have been doing. These pictures show our permanent exhibit about anthropology in North Carolina, the exhibit on objects using different parts of animals that I mentioned before, curated by my intern Robbie, and an archaeology exhibit curated by our intern David, as well as another several other student exhibits, and the exhibit that all of these objects come from culture at stake. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening today.
It looks like we have one question so far in the chat from Frank, and Frank wanted to know where is the largest number of the objects collected by Ortiz today?
That is a great question. The majority still remain in the Ortiz collection. So the Ortiz collection still is a thing. In fact, if you go to georgeortiz.com, I believe that is the George Ortiz Collections website. Ortiz passed away in 2012, but the collection is managed by a nonprofit board. And I believe, or no, actually it might be a private trust still. I believe it's a private trust. And that collection is still considered one of the, especially for ancient Grecian sculpture, considered one of the most significant collections in terms of having objects that are, unusual, rare, old, not attested to by other forms of evidence. So archaeologists still continue to be interested in it. And from an artistic side, Ortiz, as much as Ortiz was blasted by cultural heritage experts, by indigenous leaders, by archaeologists, he was never really shunned out of art worlds. And his collection has been exhibited at Christie's, at the Hermitage in Moscow, in Russia. It's been, I think, portions of it have been exhibited at the Met. So this is not a hidden collection by any means. And while he did have to auction off a portion of the ethnographic material, he did keep almost all of the antiquities intact. That is to say, within his own collection.
We don't have any more questions in the chat, but if anybody wants to put one in the chat or wants to unmute yourself, you may unmute yourself and we can do conversation that way also.
I think I'm off mute, right?
You are.
So what is the timetable for opening up the museum to the public?
That is a great question. I wish I had like concrete dates I could give you. Unfortunately, since the museum is on Wake Forest campus, we're reliant on the president of Wake Forest opening campus to the public. So that we're not sure when it will happen. There have, now that things like graduation are coming up, campus is starting to talk about like more permissive restrictions on people coming to campus. And certainly with the vaccination rollout, there could be lessening restrictive protocols. So that is to say, we don't know, but we are kind of working under the assumption that we will be able to open in the fall semester at the latest. We imagine campus will be open to visitors in some form or another by fall. Thank you for your question, though. You know, Frank knows this because I like to call on audience members all the times when I know they have specific expertise. But Bill, I actually happen to know you are the foremost researcher in Cedro Newayway associated with Captain Cook, which is just this one object. Do you have anything to add about the backstory of this specific object?
You know, just real briefly, as you mentioned, it went from Captain Cook to a series of London museums, including the Lobarium. It's interesting, though, from there, it went to a museum in the west of England and stayed there for, I think, 170 years. It was an odd little homage to James Cook that a particular Cook aficionado built in like 1806, and it stayed there until for quite a while. There was some other things in its provenance, but then it wound up with Ortiz. But I just think it's interesting. It stayed in the west of England for 170 years in this big stone kind of chapel-like place.
I actually have a photo of it right here. Thank you, Bill. So yeah, this is the museum built by Richard Hall Clark to house his shrine to Captain Cook, and where the dish resided for about 170 years, as you pointed out. Thank you. Any other questions? Frank, I see you speaking up. You're muted, though.
The Ortiz collection, you talk about it as sort of still being intact. Where is it physically, or where is the majority of it physically located now?
I believe it's still in Geneva, which is where Ortiz resided most of his life.
Is it on exhibit in Geneva, or is it in his home, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, it's on exhibit if you have access to his estate, I would guess, but it is not on public view, no.
Okay, thank you.
It's also a big part of Ortiz's philosophy. He was anti-public, right? He thought that the people who should have access to these things are the people who could pay, and that were the people who could pay were the best equipped to conserve them and enjoy them. I mean, he was very, very adamant in his classist views. All right, well, thank you everyone for attending. This was a fun talk. I don't think I've ever been a guest lecturer at a Museum of Anthropology event. I've hosted them, I've been a panelist at them, but I've never actually got to talk about any of my own research before. So in the 6 years I've been here, this was definitely a highlight. Thank you all for attending. And hopefully you'll be able to attend our next Museum of Anthropology event in April. Sarah, could you give us some more details, because I'm forgetting?
Sure, absolutely. I believe it is April 29th, so the last Thursday as this is. And we'll be talking about heritage or DNA, and Andrew and our educator, Tina Smith, will talk about their own sort of experience with doing online DNA testing and what that has told them and the accuracy of that, and all kinds of issues that brings up connected to heritage. So we'll be discussing that, and we'll welcome, if you have done that testing and found results that you have questions about or something interesting that you want to share with the group, we'll have a little more conversation with that one.
Yes, so. April's Lunch and Learn will be much more of an open table conversation. But in case there is a lull, Tina and I have taken DNA tests, and we will be talking about our results and how it relates to our own sense of heritage. So, but please do come and share your own DNA results if you've already taken one. I would love to know how much Neanderthal all of you are, because that is one of the available options you can get tested for, is what % Neanderthal you are.
Makes you either more or less susceptible to COVID, but I can't remember which one. I think less susceptible. So
all right, well, thank you everyone. Have a good afternoon.